Thank you very much, Chris. Welcome all of you to the Aspen Environment Forum. We could not be more thrilled to be launching this forum with Ed Wilson, by universal assent, one of the greatest biologists of the 20th century, and I think it's probably pretty safe ground for me to say will be regarded as well as one of the great biologists of the 21st century. And given his still prodigious contributions, which continue to mount, as someone who is often said with great merit, a worthy heir of Charles Darwin, I know we're just going to see more and more extraordinarily important, provocative work from him, work that's not only significant scientifically, but has great significance socially and culturally as well. His fame dates at least to 1967, when he wrote The Theory of Island Biogeography, which is now, of course, a classic of ecological science. I actually had the privilege of taking a class with whom I then called Professor Wilson, called Sociobiology in 1973. And of course, the book of that name came out a couple of years after that. His monumental book on insect societies had come out in 1971. And I think we were already aware we were in the presence of someone who was really going to be a giant of the biological sciences. Sociobiology, of course, like other things that have happened in his career, was initially an enormously controversial work. Like much of what Ed Wilson has done, he sometimes breaks a lot of scientific china, but it's not just that that causes the controversy, it's the fact that its implications are so profound in other disciplines, and perhaps perceived by people in those other disciplines as intrusions into their turf, whether they're social scientists or humanists. But he's learned since that time to deal with that controversy extraordinarily well, and of course we saw with sociobiology that what was initially controversial is now viewed as absolutely sound and essential and pivotal. He has won more honors and awards than we can possibly keep track of, including, of course, what is the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for the Biosciences, also a prize of the Swedish Academy of Sciences. He also, as all of you know who have had the pleasure of reading any of his books, someone who writes absolutely beautifully. He's won 2 Pulitzers. He's not only written spectacular nonfiction, he also wrote a wonderful novel called Anthill, which I recommend to all of you, which has some obviously autobiographical elements about a young boy growing up in South Alabama and featuring, of course, ants. He is now, of course, an icon of conservation, a celebrant of biodiversity, and I think it's fair to say that even the word biodiversity wouldn't have the currency that it does without the influence of Ed Wilson. His most recent book, which we'll talk about some today, and I hope all of you will be able to get, and he's going to be available, of course, to sign later this evening, is The Social Conquest of Earth. A book that already is controversial, like many of his other books, but also already very influential. Newsweek called it one of the 12 most important books of the year, but it also has received enormous attention from the scientific community, and it's fair to say now some of that is quite critical, and we will talk a little bit about that. But let's start with, and I mentioned Anthill as autobiographical. Let's start with how you started your life's work in biology. You famously wrote that most children have a bug period. I simply never grew out of mine. Now tell us about that.
Well, first let me just say how pleased I am to be, how proud I am to be here. And there's so many friends, people I admire, champions, and also I like to be associated with, and I have been pumped up every time I come close to it since I was stimulated to study ants by the 1934 issue of the world's greatest magazine, the National Geographic. Incidentally, I can tell you, I say that on any occasion, and not necessarily in presence of the high command. So anyway, yeah. Well, I did say that. Everybody has a bug. Every kid has a bug period. They're right there when the twig can be turned, and I suppose that I did be turned in that direction because I was living in Washington D.C. for a couple of years. My father worked for the REA, one of the alphabetical Rooseveltian programs in Washington, and I wandered as an only child through Rock Creek Park. We were close enough providentially to there, and I went and I looked to the National Museum and looked up the higher stories up there where I knew there were entomologists, those demigods that wrote the books and the magazine articles. And I just wanted to be that. I wanted to spend all my life collecting butterflies and ants. And then I had a snake period and the bird period, which lasted about 2 weeks when I discovered I couldn't spot any birds. And then on. And what do you make out of all this? Well, I suppose that what you make out of it are two things. One, you've got to get the kid out in the woods or natural environment as much as you possibly can. You have to make it possible for him or her to see this as an adventure, to treat it as an adventure. You've got to leave them alone. The worst thing you can do is to take them down the path of some nature park that has the label on the tree saying what species it is, and tell them, be careful not to step off this trail because there might be snakes. What a dreadful way to introduce kids to nature. Turn them loose. I think it was Rachel Carson who said, take a child to the seashore, hand him, her, hand her, a container, point to a tide pool, say, why don't you go over there and just explore over there, see what you can find. Don't tell her what she's going to find. Let her bring back what she finds, or he. And then, when their wonder is excited, tell them a little bit what you know. Oh, that's amazing. I think so-and-so. Go find some more. And that's the way to start a naturalist. And we don't do much of that these days, do we?
No, and actually I was thinking about that when you talk about how all children go through a bug period, and you think, as you're saying, about children today, so many of them occupy virtual worlds and synthetic worlds, and they're on their devices, and you said something here very provocatively a number of years ago about soccer moms even, and taking children around when they could be just exploring the woods. How big a problem do you think it is that so many children today do not have that direct, awe-inspiring experience in nature that inspired you?
I have no way of judging it, but it can't be good.
One other thing about your childhood which I found fascinating, and maybe also a lesson for children who have some kind of disabilities as well. I think it's correct that when you were 7 and you were fishing, you caught a panfish of some kind, and a dorsal spike spiked you in the eye, and you actually lost...
I lost vision in that eye. I guess there's a limit to how much you can let the kid run around. But yeah, and I turned out to be, have limited hearing ability, upper fringes, even all the way back to when I was a little kid. So I wasn't any good at following bird songs or...
You couldn't listen to frogs either, so that's why you ended up with ants. Is that right?
Well, actually, it was when I became an entomologist, sure. I pick them up and look at them closely. And as a matter of fact, before you heap in your mind contempt on ants, it's not quite as good as redwoods and birds. Bear in mind that ants are the most abundant insects by far. And that if you took all of the ants in some forest, I'll say this for the Amazon, we know it for sure, and weighed them, they would weigh, just the ants alone, more than 4 times all of the vertebrates, land vertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. You gotta pay attention to ants.
Well, we'll talk more about that too. And of course, again, a theme in your book.
Yeah.
I think there are many people who sometimes have problems with the notion that one can learn a lot about humans from ants. I mean, people have enough trouble when you say, what can you learn from apes? But ants is quite a leap.
Yeah.
But I had the opportunity to talk with Ed just before our session, and was so fascinated by some of the things you've been up to recently that rather than some of the questions I was going to begin with, I'd rather let you share with this broader audience some of these things that have been occupying. It's hard to imagine you have time with all the books you're writing, but one thing you mentioned is how you're actually now spending a lot of time studying national parks and reserves around the world. Tell us about that.
Well, this is something I've decided to enter into because I can do it. I can afford to do it, and I have a little more time now. I've entered into a study of national parks and reserves around the world. So within the last year, I've been to Ecuador. I've been to the South Pacific. I remember that the senior editor of National Geographic when I was here in 2008, when I said how much I'd like to go back to New Caledonia in the South Pacific, said, well, if you want to go and write a story, we'll send you. Well, finally I did in November. That was the first time I'd been there since intense field work I did 57 years previously. And I took a team with me, and we did studies of the ants. The first studies made in Vanuatu, formerly New Hebrides, New Caledonia we went to, and I was able to visit the sites that I had worked 57 years ago. It was amazing. And we then added a lot more toward the study I'm initiating on the place of Vanuatu in the transfer of faunas across the Pacific. Another place, of course, I've been in is Mozambique. And thanks to the hospitality and support of a great American philanthropist, Greg Carr, I've been devoting more and more of my time. I just got back. I'm advising Greg on scientific developments there or studies. And he's going to set up, he's in the process of setting it up with an Institute for Science and Science Education. And he is restoring, with his teams, the ruined fauna of the great park, Gorongosa National Park. But beyond that, if you allow me to natter on for a few moments.
No, absolutely.
I've taken a great interest in our national parks. And I've had the great pleasure and privilege of advising our national park system on bringing more scientific studies and educational efforts in environment and conservation. And beyond that, there is Mobile, my hometown. I'm working with others, and we are soon to announce the effort, and I think it will succeed, to create a new national park comprising the first one, the big one on the Gulf Coast, comprising the Mobile and Tensas Delta and the Red Hills to the north, deeply dissected with old temperate forest in them. And it will be the most biologically diverse national park in America. And beyond that, just to give you some sense of why I'm later going to say I'm optimistic. When you ask me the inevitable question, I'm optimistic.
Well, I guess I'll have to ask that question.
Yeah. And the other reason is that I'm engaged in another project, a real southern project of creating a wildlife corridor that will extend from Tallahassee and the Apalachicola to Louisiana. And we have a group now organized with many stakeholders, raising the money, working out the maps. We're going to do it. And this is a very important consideration in American conservation and biodiversity, because we really need a corridor for the east, for the west to east, drawing out of the continent.
No, I think among the many reasons that that's all very exciting is sometimes I get a sense that Americans, or not just Americans, but that many people think that nature or biodiversity is somewhere far away. You know, it's in Madagascar, or it's in some of the hot spots that you've recognized, whereas, you know, our backyards are also enormously important, and not just for that awe-inspiring experience that children need to have. So this park in Mobile is enormously exciting.
15 minutes. If you go onto the Bankhead Tunnel, from the government center in Mobile to the first entrance of what will be this park.
And then again, I think many of us think of corridors, we think of, you know, elephants getting across Africa, or corridors across the Serengeti, but there are corridors across the Panhandle that are just as important.
That's where a large part of the American fauna and flora have got to be given room to expand.
Let's talk about some of the other new work you were telling me about, which is fascinating. You know, we're all familiar with your Encyclopedia of Life, but I didn't, and I'd love to hear the status of that project and its importance. But I also learned about a new project you call Life on Earth, and actually a way to engage that technology, which sometimes distracts children from nature, but to use that technology to teach them about nature. So tell us about that.
Exactly right. There's a theme that's posed in a question I saw in the catalog of what can we get to make people change the world. And of course that brings us immediately to the whole issue of education. Education is absolutely crucial. We're not giving American kids, most of them anyway, a decent education in science, and preparing them for the techno-scientific age they're going into, and preparing them to gain some degree of wisdom we expect of citizens about the maintenance of a sustainable world and of the rest of life, preserving the rest of life. So we've got to do something about education. We're not going to, I don't think, go very far continuing to flog our underpaid, poorly prepared, overworked teachers in the American public school system today, and expect that just by being told that they've got to do it, and our Texas style, you know, they'll be fired if they haven't, the kids don't pass a certain test. We really need to bring them help, and help of a lot of kinds. But one way that could be fast is what we're doing now. This little foundation that I have my name on, although I keep trying to stay off the board of directors, has now partnered with Apple. And we have gotten full support to create a online textbook in biology for high schools, and it'll work for early college of the highest quality. 50 modules, and we've begun to produce them now, that will cover different aspects of biology using the techniques that will make an adventure out of exploring everything from the cell to an ecosystem. That's what I'm doing in part in Gorongosa, is I'm appearing and giving lectures with the animals in the forest around me. And then we add diagrams. And because this is Apple, it's Pixar quality animation. And if you're interested in seeing it, is now being nationally distributed into 32 countries. It's on E.O. Wilson, Life on Earth, as an app on iPad. And it is intended to go worldwide, bring biology education worldwide to the same level as it is in a prep school in Connecticut, at least available, you know, for the information and teaching. and free.
That's amazing. Did you ever get a chance to talk about that directly with Steve Jobs?
I did. Yeah, that was actually when we learned we were looking for money. We even talked with the representatives before the big scandal broke of Mr. Murdoch and a few others. But we learned at this point, pardon me, that Apple was looking for just this kind of thing. So we took this to Apple. And I had the pleasure of meeting, our group had the pleasure of meeting with them only several weeks before he finally pulled out. And I know for a fact that he said, this is the one.
That's very exciting.
Yes, it is.
So tell us about the status of the Encyclopedia of Life project, which as I understand it is to create a web page for every species.
Yes, it is, and that's was headquartered in Washington. It's about to move to Harvard, but it is well supported up till now. It was begun with a MacArthur grant and grant from the Sloan Foundation, and I can tell you that it's now past the halfway mark of recording with identifications and illustrations and everything known about the species. Every species on Earth, plant, animal, and soon to be microorganism, I suppose. It's past the halfway mark of the 1.9 million species on Earth. And you can find out anything you want to know about any plant or animal by tapping in eol.org. That's it, anything. And now the organization, I'm not involved with them anymore, but the organization is planning all sorts of ancillary programs that can be made out of this. Quick, instant identification. The placing of one technique that's been developed is to place just a leaf of a plant from a certain flora, and it quickly gives you the name and everything known about it. That's amazing. The way it's going.
It's amazing.
So, like it or not, ladies and gentlemen, we're in the digital age. And technology can be a big help.
Yeah, we'll maybe come back to that as well. So obviously one of your passions now, it relates to scientific education, inspiring children, not just about nature for their entire lives, but also to pursue careers in science. And tell us about your next book. I mean, and as I understand it, that's very much addressed to this problem of attracting young people into science.
Yeah, well, in addition to showing them how to go into what is in the science and making an adventure out of it, what we must do is to give them some kind of direct counseling and encouragement. So I've written a book, it'll be out next spring, entitled Letters to a Young Scientist. And so I've put down in it with frank language, as I've said to the students, prospective students, I am telling you what I know, what I have done, and what I think it'll take for you to be a success. And I'm going to tell it to you straight because I am old enough, not to be inhibited by the drag of false modesty. So I'm rather hoping that, by sort of making the students, young people going into science, the same as the ones that I sat across in my office at Harvard 40 years and sort of treat them as young colleagues and saying, okay, this is the kind of thing you've got to do. Just go out and do it. Get started. We need you. You better do it. And you better do it right. And here's basically some rules to follow in order to get it right.
Let's talk for a second about these are the things you're doing now and about to do, about some of the things you've already written about. And I think it's now about 30 years ago that when you first wrote about how the loss of genetic and species diversity could be in fact a greater catastrophe than energy depletion or economic collapse, and I think you even said limited nuclear war. so you were addressing the importance of diversity and species diversity that long ago, and I doesn't seem like people perhaps listened quite as well as they might have, because when you look today, we're living in an age of mass extinction like few others in history. So, how did this happen, and why does this matter? Why does it matter that we're seeing the kind of extinctions around the world today that we are?
I don't have to answer that to this audience.
We have a video audience too.
So I'm sorry, I forgot about you. Well, yeah, actually we're talking about the rest of life. If you're an evangelical, we're talking about the creation. I even wrote a book by that title and addressed it to a Baptist minister. It had an impact. We're talking about something of the greatest moral magnitude and significance. We're talking about our future as a species, about the maintenance that the rest of life can give us after it's been evolving 3.5 billion years to work it all out in ecosystems that are relatively stable. They go through big cycles, they respond to climate change, but they are stable beyond anything that we can conceive in our little brains. I mean, we're very proud of what we can do, and we should be. We're the mind of as far as we know, we're the mind of the universe until we get that first signal from SETI. But at any rate, one ecosystem, one pond, has more complexity, more engineering by natural selection over millions of years of natural selection to be what it is today than we could duplicate or even explain if we were given total knowledge in an entire warehouse full of parallel zeta capacity computers. That's the kind of recognition we should be giving the rest of life. And of course, you all know that the Conservation International's estimate of 10 years ago of the importance, the financial return, if one could be made, the wealth provided us in services of the natural systems left are approximately equal to the gross world product. That is the gross national product of all the countries combined, which would that's given to us scot-free. So why do we wipe that out needlessly? And then, of course, as everyone in this audience knows, the richness of information in each one of these species, each species being a library of genetic and physiological information. That information will, as biotechnology and biological biomimicry unfold in the future, as it must, going to be unlimited, infinite in value to the human species. It's insanity to think that what we, that we're willing to go ahead and see a large part of that. I think most of us working in the field agree that if we continue at the present rate of eliminating species, half of them could be gone or reduced to what we call the living dead, almost extinct by the end of this century. And I see Sylvia Earle sitting in front of me, so I have to remember, since I get scolded every time I slip up in past meetings, that I'm talking not just about the land, but I'm talking about this immense treasure house in the sea, and that to my astonishment, it should be the astonishment of everyone, or I should say to the alarm of everyone, we're finding we're actually changing the chemistry of the whole sea, and that we're wiping out, we could be wiping out not just species, but entire phyla that are found in the sea and not found on the land. So if I have gotten sufficiently exercised enough to answer your question, I will stop here.
Well, Well, let me ask a sort of another aspect about extinction, and obviously one of the things that's different about this mass extinction is that we are largely causing it, and I wonder, reading much of what you've written about ants and their enormous success, and other eusocial animals, ants and termites, they have become so successful, and frankly for eons longer than humans have been successful. We've been successful for just a tiny flash of time compared to ants. Why has their success not led to mass extinctions?
Good question. I think that you're talking now about the subject of this book, okay, The Social Conquest of Earth. And there are so many lessons in examining how advanced social life originated in the rest of the animal kingdom. And it gives us a lesson or two. One is the one you just alluded to. The advanced social animals on Earth, and there have been about 24 that I've identified, that have reached the level called eusociality, with altruistic division of labor within a group. That's happened about 24 times, of which we have knowledge. There are literally tens of thousands of lines of evolution, pardon me, that are represented in the living world today that didn't achieve it. So among these 24 are three groups which came to dominate the world. Humans, of course. The others were particularly the ants and termites, among those 24. They just took over the invertebrate world. And they started doing it 180 million years ago. And that's the point that leads me to an answer of your question. The amazing thing about the origin of advanced social life is that we had all that long life in the sea. We had a long period of tens of hundreds of millions of life on the land and through the Paleozoic, and the insects proliferated in vast numbers of species and adaptive forms. No social insects. Finally, they make their first appearance in the early Mesozoic, and when they do, they rise steadily then to dominate the world, the invertebrate world. And we didn't come along until, of course, very recently. They came along over a long period of time in which they slowly adjusted to the rest of life on the earth. And as a consequence, they co-adapted, so that not only are they not destroying ants and the other social insects, not destroying the life in which they are dominant, but a lot of that life has become dependent on their cooperation and their symbiosis. Whereas we came like a lightning strike, geologic time. When we poured out of Africa 60,000 years ago, then we struck over a period of just a few thousand years as major destroyers, and nothing could stand up in front of us. And we wiped out most of the megafauna of the world before we knew what we were doing, and now we're destroying large parts of the little things, plants, insects around the world, and we're endangering the marine environment equally. So that's the answer.
Well, in my introduction, I mentioned how controversial some of your work has been. We haven't really talked about controversy yet, so let's get into some controversy. Last August in Nature, and then you and two colleagues from Harvard published an article that amounted to an attack on what's called inclusive fitness or kin selection. For decades, the near universally accepted explanation for, among other things, altruistic behavior. Why Humans, might die for one's family or tribe or nation, but why ants die for one's queen in a colony. And the assumption had always been this notion of kin selection, that it was because of preservation of genetic relatedness, in a sort of simple-minded way. If there were people drowning in a pond out here, that if they were, my children, I'd jump in, or if they were 8 of my cousins, I'd jump in and save them, but if there were strangers, I'd let them drown. So that was really the basic theory, and you then and your colleagues said it doesn't work. And it was like all hell broke loose in the scientific community. Tell us about that, and why did it cause so much heat? And it's still causing heat because you develop it even further in this book.
Let me back up just a little. I know we're running short on time.
We're actually fine.
Okay. And as soon as my colleague Stuart Brand, begins to scowl at me, I'll insist that we bring this to a close. But what I wanted to do was answer the 3 big questions that philosophers have long since abandoned, that religion can't even begin to answer, that you see on the corner of de Gauguin's Tahitian masterpiece. I wanted to return to those questions.
Which is actually on the cover of his book.
Where do we come from, what are we, and where are we going? We don't address those questions anymore. We sort of feel they're too beyond us, or else they've already been answered by religious creation stories and so on. And as I thought about that, then I realized, and I started to develop an argument about just what we are, where we came from. And we know a lot about where we came from now, from the paleontology of Africa. But there was so much more to it. I realized that in addressing those questions, there were 2 fundamental questions, even more fundamental questions, that we had to answer first, that it hadn't even been asked. And those are the ones I just alluded to, which is why, if it's so successful, why is it so rare? I think I answered that question by tracking what was known of the evolutionary lines that led up to the eusocial species, something that hadn't been done, at least in this context. So I have an answer, and I won't go into it now. I think I have the answer of why it's so rare. That's important. But in addition, then, the second big question that had to be answered is, what is the driving force of selection, natural selection, and the circumstances that made it possible? In other words, that in effect really lifted us up above the Australopithecine with chimpanzee-sized brains from Africa. And then I came up, when I did that, against the prevailing theory, which I helped promote, in the 70s myself. It seemed logical. Kin selection theory, or it's known as inclusive fitness theory. And I realized that this wasn't working so well. It was crumbling. A couple of the major predictions it had made, phylogenetic predictions, had failed, and they were just sort of brushed aside. A substantial number of biologists, nevertheless, were still developing it with ever more complex mathematical models and teaching it. It was in the textbooks. So it was tough to come up to against, but it just wasn't doing the job. And so I published a series of articles. It didn't hit all at once 2 years ago with my mathematical associates. And I started pointing out the difficulties and why we should perhaps consider abandoning the core postulate, which is the Hamilton inequality. And I won't go into this now technically, but we better think that maybe that's not right in some manner. At any rate, the conclusions being drawn weren't good enough. They were only fitting a few cases, and those were being spoken over and over again. They were not fitting other cases, And they, above all, they were not fitting the human species, telling us anything about where we came from or why we came the way we did. And so I published a whole series of papers, prominently, and was mostly ignored, that something's wrong here. And we should go back to multi-level selection and think this through again, or maybe adopt it again. This was the prevailing view, sort of, from Darwin to the time of the population geneticist of the 1920s, but they didn't know how to push it beyond where it was. And so nobody much picked up on that suggestion because there was, I think, an establishment and something of a dogma that just you taught this is what you taught in college and so on. Then two mathematicians of the first rank, and I use that carefully because they took mathematicians of the first rank, came to me and said, we've been working on it, this problem, not because of me, but they sort of they did get one of my papers to help lead them there. But they said, we have been solving the problem of the Hamilton inequality, taking it down in all of its possible implications, all the way to the foundation. It's an extremely difficult mathematical problem, and we have solved it and shown that it's unsound, that it fits only could fit only a very narrow number of situations which do not exist on planet Earth. And therefore, as they saw it, they agreed. We have to go back to multi-level selection and start developing a whole new body of theory from that. Well, we published this in 2010 in Nature in the most intensely vetted article I think they ever did. When we sent this to them, we had the mathematical proof. We had, in my part, I showed how case after case of eusociality and altruism in animals is better explained if you know the full greater amount about the natural history of that species, its life cycle, much better explained by either individual level selection or multi-level with group selection combined with individual level selection. So that an editor from Nature came over, mathematically trained, editor, and went through the whole thing with us. Then they sent it out to some extremely good and rigorous reviewers, and then it came out. And the reaction was explosive. I mean, we had over 130 of our colleagues write a letter saying that it can't be true. 18 months, that we must have lost something. I think actually there were people going around saying, what's wrong with Wilson? They did. Maybe I was losing it. But at any rate, 18 months later, the basic argument has not been refuted. It has not even been seriously challenged. And now we're seeing a lot of people coming over. And I would conclude by saying this is an example of a basic principle. Science does not proceed by rhetoric and by polling.
And also, I don't know who it was who said that often when there's a paradigm-breaking theory like that, the stages are ridicule and then outrage and then finally just, it's obvious.
Yeah, that's right.
Schopenhauer.
Is this working? Yeah, Schopenhauer. It fitted nicely. He said a really new idea, if it's correct, is met first with ridicule, then with outrage, and finally with a statement, well, that's approximately what we were trying to say in the first place.
Well, I said, or you mentioned, that I was going to ask you a question about why you're so optimistic or can be so optimistic, and then I'm going to turn questions over to the audience. So let me ask that question. You've written that a century from now, it's possible that the Earth could be a paradise for humans in perpetuity. But there are many signs now that we're not moving in that direction. So why are you an optimist?
Well, it's just that I've seen in my own experience that there are so many really good people out there. who really want to do something important. And somehow they haven't been fully empowered because of the paralysis of our social and economic systems, political and economic systems, and by the abysmal ignorance of our political leaders. So, and yet there is a feeling that it's somehow the right thing to do. And if we could combine that with examples made around the world, that's why I'm trying to, promote the national parks and reserves around the world and make a system of studying it and bringing it to the attention of scientists and others in a new and I hope more rigorous way. I think that we are capable of doing it. I guess I'm just an optimist that we will do it because I use one phrase that was used by Abba Eban. It's my favorite remark. Abba Eban was a foreign minister of Israel at the time of the 1967 war. And in the midst of all that madness, he said, well, he was optimistic because when all else fails, people turn to reason. And maybe I think, in the political scene and the economic scene and in the environment, maybe we're approaching the turning point to reason. That's my hope.
Well, let's hope so. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to give you all a chance to ask some questions. Do we have, Tarek, do we have microphones? We do. So anyone who would like to ask a question, if you could raise your hand, and I will, there's a woman here in the third row. If you could just tell us your name and the question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Suzanne Clary, and I'm wondering, do you have any advice on how do we educate the public about the threat of invasive species to native species? A lot of people don't know what invasive species are.
Tell them. It's amazing. It's a good question that you bring up. I think both of you know the Hippo Formula. That's the acronym for the major causes of extinction of species. H stands for habitat destruction, I for invasive species, first P for pollution, the second P for overpopulation, and O for overharvesting, that is overhunting and overfishing. Well, what people don't realize is, and I know you know it better than I because that's why you asked the question, was that we are increasingly everywhere in the world, especially where there are a lot of people, having our native fauna and flora replaced by foreign species. For example, a horror show, I know they love me for this in Hawaii Chamber of Commerce, the horror show is Hawaii. You come in and it's, bursting with flowers, birds are in singing and everything, and it's all foreign, it's all alien. If you want to see a native bird or a plant, you have to go up in the mountains, get cold, wet, and tired. And the number of invasive species, country by country, where they've been measured is that are establishing virtually exponential. Worldwide, the number of invasive species that are going around the world is exponential. When I was in New Caledonia, I went to the Isle of Pines. I'll tell you one more horror story. Where we sought to find a species of ant thought extinct, the unique New Caledonian bull ant, a big character, and we found it. But we found only 3 colonies. It was, it's on the brink of extinction. And what we saw there too, the French know about this, was a solid wave of a little ant called the little fire ant, Wasmannia auropunctata. It's formed super colonies, and it's spreading slowly but surely. And where it goes through the litter, covers the natural forests of the Isle of Pines and New Caledonia. Virtually all the invertebrates are destroyed, all the native ants, everything. And this wave is about 2 miles from the last of that particular ant and probably a lot of other native species. There are lots of cases like this. And I think what we need to do, this is something for the media to do, something for us to put into teaching, I don't know, is to illustrate these cases and make a point of what we're losing.
Paul Anderson.
Thank you. Paul Anderson. I write for the Aspen Times, and I'm a big fan of yours, Mr. Wilson, and Consilience in particular. You conclude this book with a little side note to Paul Gauguin, and you suggest that by bringing rational analysis and art together, and by joining science and humanities in partnership, that we may be able to answer the questions he asked, particularly the question of where we're going. How do we do that? How do we break the boundaries of disciplines and end the turf wars in academia and sort of do away with specialization in preference to the bigger holistic view?
I thought that's an easy one. I thought for a moment you were going to say that you just disproved the, our formulation. At any rate, the solving of the problem. At any rate, I can't answer that except to say that a large part of it is due to the extreme specialization of academics and teachers, and also of authors of the New York Review of Books and others of the dwindling group of increasingly less respected intellectuals. And part of the reason why this high degree of specialization is occurring is not stupidity, it's not lack of effort. It is because knowledge is doubling every 10 to 20 years, in science especially, and that to get to the frontier and do what scientists do, which make discoveries, almost decrees that they will be limited to a large part of their career unless they make a special effort to focus on one specialty. What we need increasingly are synthesizers, but of good enough quality to really make the connections and handle overall conceptions of knowledge in new ways. And I think that the promising part about this is I go to a lot of universities where this was brought up. And I'm meeting more and more people and deans and really bright young professors who are deliberately creating programs intermediate between science, particularly the biological sciences, and the humanities and social sciences, recognizing that the great gap between the great branches of learning that we've often thought were insuperable are in fact just areas of phenomena primarily and understanding that we haven't achieved yet. And that's where the excitement will be in the 21st, part of the excitement in the 21st century, is searching in that intermediate area. The thing that really convinces me that academia, and scholars and thinkers will move in this direction is that there are 2 such programs started up even at Harvard.
Another question. Yes, I think I see a hand right there.
Thank you. My name's Kate. I'm from the University of Minnesota and state of Minnesota, and we were on the plane coming here, and I was so starstruck I didn't even say hello to you on the plane from Denver to Aspen. And I wanted to be an entomologist as a kid as well, so, and hoping to still become one. But you talked a little bit about how you became a scientist, and I've read your writings on that a bit as well. And I'm also curious how you became a writer, and you're such a prolific writer and such a inspiring writer that it makes your science come alive in a way that very few scientists can do. So how did you do that, and how do you do it now?
Well, I really hesitate to say it because, you know, I make you already think I'm entirely too self-regarding as it is. But the answer is talent. And, you know, we all have these talents. I don't have it in mathematics, and I had to go to others. I don't have it in, you know, mechanical or spatio-temporal. I don't have that intelligence. But I got a letter, my parents got a letter when I was in Washington on little Ed. She said, Ed knows an unusual lot about insects. Mind you, I was 9 years old. Said, they didn't say little, Ed knows a lot about insects. And he's a very good writer. If he could put those two together, he might accomplish something.
Here in the front. Just wait for the microphone if you would. Here you go.
Hi, Randy Olson, filmmaker. You had said, you were talking about extinction, I think, and you said something about the greatest moral issue, crisis. Is that what you were saying?
What was that, Randy?
Yeah.
And hi, how are you?
Great, thanks.
I haven't seen you in a long time.
Yes.
What was that again?
You were talking about extinction, I think, and you said something to the effect of the greatest moral issue, crisis. Didn't you say those words? Greatest moral?
I'm sure I did. Put it that way, but because it's certainly true. I mean.
Okay, so you know, I grew up in Kansas, and I have lots of friends back there that are non-academics. And if I were to ask them, what do you think is the greatest moral issue, crisis facing us today? I don't think any of them would say extinction of species. I think that moral, almost by definition, is kind of human-centric. So if you think that, how would you convey this to those sort of folks?
The long, hard road, because they're faced with daily problems that involve moral decisions that affect them in a very personal and narrow way. They're thinking short term, they're thinking short distance. And of course they have to. This is survival now for people all around the world, as it has been most of the time. And so all I can say is that we have to change that so that they add long-term and long distance. I think you know that as well as I, if not better. I'm asking you how. Well, the answer I have is one word, and you won't be satisfied with it: education. And that's what I'm talking about. Education for the kids to make science and the world and the living world an adventure that they want to be part of. Education for the adults, which tell us what we really are and not what we dream we are in our various ideologies and religious creation stories.
You know, I'm going to use moderator's license here for a second because I can't resist your focus so much on education and how important children understand science and also the importance of rationality. Why are anti-evolutionary forces so successful in the United States?
Well, I have an answer for that, which, as a recovering Southern Baptist, I feel confident about. But on the other hand, there may be those in the audience who are capable of answering it in history and social sciences better than I, but I'll give it a shot. America is still a frontier country, or it thinks it's a frontier country. After all, it was only 100 years ago that we really closed, a little more than 100, that we closed the frontier, the real open country of the West. I met a veteran of the Civil War when I was a little kid. You know, history is short. And you will recall that once the English ruling class built the cities along the eastern seaboard and thrived by trade and, for the most part, in the middle and New England states by freehold farmers, that now they could look to western Pennsylvania, and this is the late 1700s, and beyond, and there was a frontier. So the people, our people, and those in generations to come, spread across the frontier. And as they spread across the frontier, then they spread out to, to have sufficient farmland, and they had small communities in most places at best. They had left behind the highly organized 2,000-year-old religion of Europe. They left behind cathedrals, bishops, theologians, and centuries of order based upon a particular belief, understood mostly just by clerics and scholars and passed to them. Now they're out in the prairie. They're Christians for the most part, and what final authority have they got left? The Bible. And that's happened over and over again, that biblical literalism replaced the bishops and all that authority, and they could agree on what was written in the sacred book. And that's the reason why, to this day, having organized themselves and seeing themselves as a community, it's tribalism is what it is, basically, seeing themselves as a community united by a very powerful belief from which they draw their personal identity, understanding, and feeling for it. They are not going to give up biblical literalism just because a bunch of Ivy League professors say so.
Another question on the aisle here.
Hi, my name is Gord Miller. I'm the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, Canada. And I'm an ecologist by training, and I've read your stuff for many years. But to me, so I work in this policy field of trying to sort of tackle some of these real problems, and with respect to the government of Ontario particularly. And the problems always come back to neoclassical economists and the economic models that government decisions are made on, and it forms so many of the decisions on how we live our lives. So it's not a problem from my perspective from the humanities. It's a problem with our economic models that we've universally adopted. They're the new high priests. And I just wanted to get your reflection if you agree with that, or you see that, or have you ever pondered that conundrum?
I'm not sure if I can.
Well, let me just give me a specific, I mean, many of the things you talk about are long-term, require long-term thinking and perspectives, psychological perspectives, whereas our economic models, depreciated present values will run anything out to, after 50 years, no matter what your interest rate is, pretty well to zero value. The future has no value in economics. Okay. And of course, the future is everything in ecology.
Well, I know. The real problem with economics and our economic problem policy is its lack of predictable capacity. And I've sort of said enough outrageous things already, I guess, but I'm going to say one more. It was a terrible mistake to give the economist a Nobel Prize. They, what they did was, sometimes with brilliance, was to provide us with a truncated account of human behavior and assumptions, oversimplified assumptions about originally Homo economicus, but of course they've modified it as they've gone along. But economists, not any economist of my acquaintance, have ever been successful at reaching down into the realms of our research and understanding of how the human mind works. And here's where we need a history of the human mind and an understanding of human instinct, reach down far enough to give us economic models that are reliably predictable. Human beings just do not behave the way most of the economists would like to think they do or are likely to do. And so we're sort of at sea until something much better in the way of economic science with some fundamental changes being put into it, is achieved, in my opinion.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank our guest, Ed Wilson, for a wonderful conversation.